Hey, welcome back. It's just before 6:20, and it's time to take a look at your money. This morning marks the first Monday markets open after last week's interest rate cut. On Wednesday, the U.S. Federal Reserve lowered its benchmark Fed funds rate by a quarter of 1%. Now, this was the first time the Federal Reserve had lowered interest rates this year. But what impact will this have on consumers, businesses, and the broader U.S. economy? Moreover, can we expect additional rate cuts from the Federal Reserve in the upcoming months?
Financial advisor Mark Grevicheski is joining us live to break this down for us. Good morning, Mark.
Morning, Devin. Morning, Ava. You know what? Quickly, I just realized today is the first day of the fall season. So, Andrew, if you can keep that snow away from us from as long as possible, it would be much appreciated.
Yeah,
We'll pass along the message.
in the Midwest, work in progress. Well, let's talk about our topic. For those of us who aren't familiar with the Federal Reserve, what role does it play within the economy?
Yeah, as part of its mandate, so to speak, the Fed guides our nation's monetary policy. Ultimately, Devin, its goal is to kind of manipulate and influence spending, employment, inflation to promote the health of our economy. And one of its main tools to do that is to adjust what's called the Fed funds rate, which serves as a basis for many types of consumer debt. As the Fed funds rate is either raised or lowered, it will inherently raise or lower interest rates on credit cards, bank loans, auto loans, and even home mortgages. And by manipulating interest rates, the Fed ultimately wants to influence consumer and business spending and the level of growth within our economy.
So, Mark, what was the Federal Reserve's reasoning behind its decision to lower the Fed funds rate on Wednesday?
Okay, look, if you remember back in kind of 2022, 2023, the Fed raised the Fed funds rate from near 0% all the way up to a level between 5.25, 5.5%. And the Fed's goal was to help reduce inflation, which had soared to a 41-year high of 9% in 2022. By raising interest rates, Ava, the Fed hoped to reduce spending by making it more expensive to buy goods and services on credit. As spending falls, inflationary pressures should also likely ease. But high interest rates act as a tremendous weight on consumer spending, business spending, and the broader economy. And as inflation started to decline, the Fed's new task was to gradually start lowering the Fed funds rate and by proxy, thus start lowering interest rates on consumer and business debt. Because if interest rates stay too high too long, it risks consumer and business spending literally falling off a cliff and potentially triggering a recession.
Now, when can we expect the Federal Reserve to announce further reductions to the Fed funds rate?
The Fed, based on its meeting on Wednesday, the Fed now projects that it will further lower the Fed funds rate, by a quarter of 1% at each of its upcoming meetings in October and then in December. But it now sees just one more quarter point rate hike, or sorry, reduction, for all of next year in 2026. So as of now, interest rates are expected to kind of come down a little bit, but still remain fairly high.
And why has President Trump been so vocal in wanting the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates?
Yeah, he's been quite vocal. Let's be honest about that. But look, in full disclosure, over the past 4 to 5 years, Devin, in much of my public commentary, I've also been very critical of the Fed. If you remember, in 2021, 2022, as inflation went from 1.4% to a 41-year high of 9%. The Fed was trying to convince the world that not to worry about inflation, that it would be short term, it would be transitory, it would be mild. And in reality, it was anything but that. And right now, there is this divide on Wall Street that, look, the Fed is simply not lowering interest rates fast enough. And that once again the Fed is behind the curve. And look, President Trump is leading that charge. And when that argument is coming from the power of the White House, those comments do tend to take center stage in this debate. But yes, he's been extremely vocal about it.
It seems like a focus we keep circling back to, trying to see which direction is it going.
Always a changing
Yep,
landscape.
we'll keep a close eye on it.
All right. Thank you so much, Mark, and we'll see you next Monday.